Princess Anne just walked out of the royal family, and no one was ready. Princess Anne didn't post a statement, she didn't hold a press conference, she didn't want a crowd, a curtain call, or a formal goodbye. There were no flashing cameras, no journalists waiting by the gates, just a few quiet steps down the corridor of Edinburgh Castle, and then, silence. She folded her uniforms, embraced her staff, whispered a final thank you, and left. After more than half a century of public service, the royal family's most devoted figure walked away, and she did it without making a sound. "I didn't serve for the crown," she said, turning to her aides. "I served for you all." It was simple, it was quiet, but it shook the monarchy to its core. Her words echoed in the stone halls, reverberating through centuries of tradition and protocol. Not just because they marked the end of her official duties, but because they spoke to something deeper, an emotional shift inside the palace walls that had been building for months. Her team was stunned into silence. Staff who had worked beside her for decades, who had watched her navigate crisis after crisis with unwavering determination, were caught completely off guard. Many of them cried when she left, not the polite tears of ceremony, but the raw grief of losing someone irreplaceable. Some said they felt like the soul of the institution had just walked out the door, leaving behind an emptiness that no amount of pomp or circumstance could fill. But how did it come to this? Why would the most consistent, duty-driven royal, the woman who never missed an engagement, never complained about the workload, never sought the spotlight, choose to leave now, without fanfare, without a replacement, without even a transition plan? The answer lies not in a single moment of drama, but in a slow erosion of everything she believed the monarchy should represent. The real Princess Anne. To understand the magnitude of this departure, we need to look at who Princess Anne really was, not the caricature painted by tabloids or the distant figure glimpsed in official photographs, but the woman who redefined what it meant to serve. She was never the flashiest royal, she never courted attention or played the media game, she rarely gave interviews, actively avoided celebrity culture, and consistently rejected image-focused roles that might have boosted her public profile, but she showed up, every single time. Rain or shine, scandal or celebration, controversy or calm, Anne was there. When other royals were dealing with personal drama, strategic repositioning, or reputation management, Anne was showing up for events most people didn't even know were happening. She clocked in over 500 official engagements per year, a staggering number that dwarfed many of her relatives combined. Her itinerary read like a map of Britain's forgotten corners, a struggling prison in the Midlands one day, a family farm facing foreclosure the next, an underfunded hospital ward the day after that. These weren't photo opportunities or carefully staged visits designed to generate positive headlines. They were check-ins, genuine attempts to understand and address real problems facing real people, and she didn't arrive in designer gowns or with sprawling entourages. She often traveled with just one assistant, sometimes one security officer, and usually carried her own thermos of tea, a practical touch that became legendary among those who worked with her. People knew her as authentic in a world of artifice, blunt when diplomacy might have been easier, grounded when others seemed to float above the concerns of ordinary life. She asked questions no one else bothered to ask, recalled one healthcare worker who met Anne during a particularly difficult period for the NHS. Real questions about staffing levels, about patient care, about what we actually needed rather than what looked good in a press release. And she actually listened to the answers, took notes, followed up weeks later with specific solutions. A different kind of royal. One of the key differences between Anne and other members of the royal family was her approach to public service. She didn't treat visits like ceremonies or obligations to be endured. She treated them like genuine opportunities to make a difference, to understand problems from the ground up, to build relationships that lasted far beyond a single appearance. This approach resonated deeply with the people she served. Charity workers loved her because she understood their constraints and fought for their funding. Military veterans trusted her because she honored their service without sentimentality or political grandstanding. Farmers and volunteers and teachers and social workers all called her our royal, not a royal, a distinction that meant everything to someone who had spent her life trying to bridge the gap between privilege and purpose. In Scotland she was especially beloved, treated less like visiting royalty and more like a respected neighbor who happened to hold a significant title. People in Edinburgh have countless stories of her walking to events with minimal security, dropping by schools unannounced to see how programs were really working, attending private church services where no media were invited and no official record was kept. After each visit she'd write personal notes, not just to the organizers or officials, but to everyone she'd met, the janitor who'd shown her around, the volunteer who'd explained a particular program, the child who'd asked her a question. Not form letters or brief acknowledgments, but thoughtful responses that showed she'd been paying attention, that their interaction had mattered to her. So when she left Edinburgh Castle for the final time, it wasn't just the staff inside who felt the loss. The ripple effects spread throughout Scotland and beyond. People left flowers at the gates, not the formal arrangements typical of royal occasions, but simple bouquets picked from gardens, wildflowers gathered from countryside walks. Notes appeared, tied to railings with ribbon or tucked between the iron bars. One man, his handwriting shaky with age, simply wrote, "You never treated us like subjects, you treated us like neighbors." The quiet storm. Anne never wanted praise or recognition for this approach. She deflected compliments, avoided interviews about her work, and consistently redirected attention to the causes she supported rather than her own contributions. But when she walked away, the silence she left behind felt louder than any tribute, more powerful than any official statement. Still, this wasn't a sudden decision born from a moment of frustration or a single disagreement. It was the result of months, perhaps years, of tension quietly building inside the royal family, pressure that had been invisible to the public, but increasingly unbearable for someone who valued substance over strategy. At the center of this growing tension was something few outside the palace walls fully understood: a fundamental shift in how royal power was being distributed and exercised, complicated by King Charles's health struggles and the corresponding rise of Queen Camilla's influence. It all started during King Charles's most serious health crisis. As he stepped back from certain duties to focus on treatment and recovery, family members naturally began filling the gaps in the royal schedule. At first, Camilla's increased presence seemed temporary, a logical response to extraordinary circumstances. But over time, her role expanded beyond simple substitution. She started attending high-level strategy meetings that had previously been limited to senior working royals. She began making decisions about patronages, about which causes the monarchy would support, about how resources would be allocated. She took over responsibilities that Anne had quietly carried for decades, often without consultation or acknowledgement of the transition. Royal insiders, speaking carefully and off the record, began noting a significant change in palace dynamics. If you wanted something done quickly, if you needed a decision or approval, one longtime staff member observed, you used to go through Anne. She'd cut through the bureaucracy, make things happen. But suddenly the message became, if you want something done now, you go through Camilla. The freeze. For Anne, this shift represented more than a simple reorganization of duties. It struck at the heart of everything she'd built over 5 decades of service. She wasn't interested in competing for influence or fighting for recognition. She had never sought power for its own sake, but she desperately wanted to remain useful, to continue the work that had defined her adult life. As Camilla's control grew, Anne's influence diminished in ways both subtle and significant. Meetings she had once led were rescheduled without her input. Briefings on causes she'd championed for years somehow failed to reach her. Messages from organizations seeking royal support were redirected to other offices. The communication channels between Anne and King Charles, once direct, frequent, and collaborative, grew increasingly formal and infrequent. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a public argument, explained one royal aide who witnessed this period. It was more insidious than that, a quiet freeze, a gradual shutting out. Anne would arrive for meetings only to discover they'd been moved or cancelled. She'd prepare detailed reports on her patronages, only to have them acknowledged briefly and set aside. The breaking point came during a high-level family meeting about succession planning and the future direction of the monarchy. Anne, drawing on her decades of experience and deep understanding of public sentiment, raised concerns about how rapidly changes were being implemented without adequate family discussion or coordination. She reportedly argued that decisions affecting the monarchy's future were being made by too few people, that important voices, including those of working royals who understood the institution's day-to-day realities, were being excluded from crucial conversations. Her concerns weren't about personal recognition, but about institutional stability, about maintaining the delicate balance between tradition and evolution that had served the monarchy well through previous transitions. According to multiple palace sources, King Charles's response was brief and dismissive. "We all have to evolve, Anne. The final mission." To most observers, such a comment might sound reasonable, even progressive. But to Anne, who had spent her entire adult life evolving the monarchy through quiet innovation and authentic engagement, it carried a much deeper message.
It suggested that her approach, showing up, doing the work, maintaining direct connections with the people, was now considered outdated, inefficient, perhaps even counterproductive to the monarchy's modern image. The comment implied that her decades of faithful service, her hundreds of engagements per year, her personal relationships with countless organizations and individuals were obstacles to progress rather than foundations for future success. It told her that being dependable was less valuable than being adaptable, that consistency mattered less than compliance. But before she could process the full implications of this conversation, Charles made one final request of his sister. He needed someone to deliver a private message, handwritten, sensitive, and deeply personal to a senior political figure overseas. The mission required absolute discretion, total trust, and the kind of diplomatic skill that came only from decades of representing the crown in delicate situations. He asked Anne, and only Anne, to handle this task. No staff accompaniment, no official record, no media attention, just a quiet trip, a confidential conversation, and a safe return. Anne agreed without hesitation, as she always had. She traveled light, stayed just one night, conducted her business with characteristic efficiency, and returned to Britain as quietly as she'd left. But something fundamental had changed during that brief absence. Her closest aides noticed it immediately. A new withdrawal, a deeper seriousness, a weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. She didn't talk about what happened during that trip, one long-serving staff member recalled. Anne was always private about official business, but this was different. Something in her eyes had changed. She looked like someone who'd seen something she couldn't unsee, learned something she couldn't forget, the goodbye. Soon after her return, Anne made her decision. There would be no public announcement, no formal retirement ceremony, no farewell tour of her patronages, just a simple, private goodbye to the people who had supported her work for decades. She met individually with her closest staff members, some of whom had worked with her for more than 30 years. Together they folded her official uniforms, each one representing countless engagements, thousands of miles traveled, hundreds of thousands of people met. They packed her personal office, sorting through decades of correspondence, photographs, and mementos from a life spent in service. The farewells were emotional but controlled, reflecting Anne's lifelong preference for substance over sentiment. There were tears, certainly, and quiet salutes from military personnel who had served alongside her. There were long embraces with staff who had become family, promises to stay in touch that everyone hoped would be kept. And then, without fanfare or ceremony, Anne stepped into a car and left Edinburgh Castle for the final time as a working royal. The aftermath. The next day, the castle felt fundamentally different, empty in a way that couldn't be filled by rearranging furniture or reassigning duties. The silence seemed to echo in corridors where Anne's practical footsteps had marked the rhythm of royal service for generations. Many staff members chose to retire rather than adapt to the new reality. Others were reassigned to different roles within the royal household. A few remained, still processing what had really happened, still wondering if there might have been another way. But one thing became increasingly clear in the weeks that followed. This wasn't a simple retirement, a natural transition from one phase of life to another. It was something more complex, perhaps a form of protest, perhaps an expression of heartbreak, perhaps both. People who knew Anne best, who had worked with her through decades of change and challenge, believed she didn't leave because she was tired of the work. She left because she no longer recognized the institution she'd served so faithfully. The values she embodied, service over celebrity, substance over style, quiet leadership over public relations, were being systematically replaced by a different vision of what the monarchy should be. She couldn't stay silent about this transformation, but she also couldn't speak out directly without damaging the institution she still loved. So she chose the most powerful form of communication available to her: absence. By leaving, she sent a message that continues to reverberate through the corridors of power: the future question. That silence is still sending shockwaves through the monarchy and beyond. Because Anne wasn't just another working royal fulfilling ceremonial duties. She was the most respected member of the family, the most trusted, the most genuinely devoted to the ideals of public service. She held the institution together during scandals and divorces, political controversies and public opinion shifts. She was the steady constant when everything else seemed to be changing. And now she's gone. The monarchy continues to evolve rapidly, perhaps more rapidly than at any time since the abdication crisis of 1936. King Charles continues to battle health issues that limit his public appearances and clearly affect his physical presence. Queen Camilla has assumed unprecedented influence for a consort, reshaping both the style and substance of royal engagement. Prince William and Princess Kate are taking on expanded responsibilities as the future of the institution, and while they remain popular with the public, they're also under enormous pressure to represent both continuity and change, tradition and modernity. Anne always warned them about this balance. "Don't lose the people," she repeatedly told William, urging him not to let image management become more important than genuine purpose. She admired Kate's grace under pressure, but worried that the younger generation was being pushed too hard, too fast, without the institutional stability that effective monarchy requires. Perhaps she stepped away not to abandon the institution she loved, but to give it space to find its new identity without her presence complicating the transition. Or perhaps she left to avoid being part of changes she couldn't support in good conscience. The weight behind the crown. Without Anne, there's an undeniable gap in the royal structure. A missing anchor. Someone who didn't care about being adored or celebrated, only about being dependable, about doing the work that needed to be done regardless of recognition or reward. She wasn't a symbol or a figurehead. She was a worker, a steady hand, a voice of practical wisdom in an institution often dominated by abstract concerns about image and legacy. She carried not the crown itself, but the weight of responsibility that gives the crown its meaning. And when that weight walks away, everything feels lighter in the immediate term, but also fundamentally less stable. That's the question people are asking now, from historians and journalists to palace staff and ordinary citizens. Everyone who ever looked at Anne's approach to royal duty and thought, that's what this should be about. Can the monarchy stay grounded without her steady influence? Has it already begun to drift toward something entirely different from what she represented? And what does it mean for an institution rooted in service when its most committed servant chooses silence over compliance? If you've made it this far through this story, thank you for taking the time to understand a narrative that many people haven't heard, and perhaps one the palace hoped wouldn't be told. Princess Anne's silent exit wasn't just about stepping down from official duties. It was about standing up for principles that she believed were essential to the monarchy's soul: authentic service, genuine connection with people, and the quiet leadership that builds trust rather than simply commanding attention. Her silence continues to speak, posing questions about duty and authenticity, about tradition and change, about what it really means to serve. These are questions that will shape not just the future of the British monarchy, but our understanding of what leadership looks like in an age of constant performance and endless scrutiny. And Anne's answer to those questions, it echoes still in the corridors of Edinburgh Castle, in the community she served, and in the hearts of everyone who believes that the best leaders are often those who work hardest to remain invisible while making everyone around them shine brighter. The real story isn't always the one that makes headlines. Sometimes it's the one told in silence, and Anne's silence may be the most powerful statement of all.